We're continuing on with the 19th chapter, most of which is the big Massa burden, prophecy, judgment, if you will, against Egypt. And all of these countries that are listed here as we go through Isaiah are countries that have in one way or another persecuted the Jews. Egypt, as we saw a couple of weeks ago, in large measure have persecuted the Jews. And next week, when we get into verse 16 and beyond, we're going to see how they did it in the 20th century and how it's characterized there. And then we're going to end up with what the ultimate disposition is of the nation Egypt, if you will, in the millennial kingdom. So I'm going to read from Isaiah chapter 19, verses 5 to 15, and then, as is our custom, we'll go over them individually. And the waters shall fail from the sea, and the river shall be wasted and become dry. And the rivers shall become foul. The streams of Egypt shall be diminished and dried up. The reeds and flags shall wither away. The meadows by the Nile, by the brink of the Nile, and all the sown fields of the Nile shall become dry, be driven away, and be no more. And the fishers shall lament, and all they that cast angle into the Nile shall mourn, and they that spread nets upon the water shall languish. Moreover, they that work in combed flax, and they that weave white cloth, shall be confounded. And the pillars of Egypt shall be broken in pieces. All they that work for hire shall be grieved in soul. The princes of Zoan are utterly foolish. The counsel of the wisest counselor of Pharaoh is become brutish. How say ye unto Pharaoh, I am the son of the wise, the son of ancient kings? Where then are the wise men? And let them tell thee now, and let them know what Jehovah of hosts hath purposed concerning Egypt. The princes of Zoan are become fools. The princes of Memphis are deceived. They have caused Egypt to go astray, that are the cornerstone of her tribes. Jehovah hath mingled a spirit of perverseness in the midst of her, and they have caused Egypt to go astray in every work thereof, as a drunken man staggereth in his vomit. Neither shall there be for Egypt any work which head or tail, palm branch or rush may do. So this is a prophecy about the Nile River drying up. Now let's look at verses 5 and 6, our first two verses. Where the text reads, And the water shall fail from the sea, and the river shall be wasted and become dry, and the rivers shall become foul. The streams of Egypt shall be diminished and dried up. The reeds and flags shall wither away. These are powerful prophecies. And in this particular prophecy, it has never yet happened. It's really interesting to read the ancient history of Egypt, and I spent quite a bit of time in Encyclopedia Britannica this week. It's never happened. The Nile has never dried up. So this is a prophecy yet future to us. And we're going to see some events that have happened in the last maybe 80 years or so that are going to contribute towards this. The Mediterranean Sea and the Red Sea are not what is in focus here. It is the Nile. And the Nile has been called a sea. I put a couple of verses from Isaiah 18 and Nahum 3, where it is referred to as a sea. And a lot of the ancient Arabs referred to it as such. And I've only put one resource from Herodotus using that terminology. So we're certain, based on the context, that this is talking about the Nile, because right after the beginning of the first verse, it goes right in to talk about the Nile. And The Nile River is one of the longest rivers in the world. It's about 4,100 miles. Now think about that, 4,100, that's longer than the Mississippi. And it has an enormous delta. The strange part about the river is that it flows from south to north. So Upper Egypt is down in the south, Upper Nile. Lower Nile is in the north. You know, we have a tendency to say up north or down south, and that causes confusion. So we got to keep that in our mind here. The flow of this river is from the south to the north. It begins near Lake Victoria in Uganda, Tanzania, and Kenya. 4,100 miles later, it empties into the Mediterranean Sea. It has got an enormous delta, and it's extremely fertile. Again, the upper Nile is in the south, the lower Nile is in the north. There are 10 African nations that come in contact with this river. Burundi, Tanzania, Rwanda, the Democratic Republic of Congo, Kenya, Uganda, Sudan, Ethiopia, and South Sudan. A lot of people are dependent upon this river. And we've got to try and get a vision of this massive flow of water, fresh water, in an area that is desolate desert. And here's this river with its lush banks from the overflowing of the river on an annual basis, providing the silt that is great soil and the delta great soil. About 95% of the population, at least in 1962, in the Encyclopedia Britannica that I have, lived near the Nile. Very few people live away from it because this is where life is provided. It has three main tributaries, the White Nile, the Blue Nile, and Atbara. I've put two maps in your notes. The map on the left is a zooming out, if you will, of the Nile and the region, and the one on the right shows the three tributaries and Lake Victoria in the south. The delta is extremely fertile, and I can't emphasize that enough, because of the large silt deposits on its banks. It has an annual flooding like most rivers do, and that produces this lush green area on either side and the delta. This has given Egypt its fundamental economic sustenance. There are other areas in their economy today, but nothing surpasses the Nile in what it does. And it has given them food, and it has given them a lot of material from the crops, such as beans, cotton, wheat, flax, and these things are easily traded and used in their economy and for food. It was also in ancient times the ideal growing region because of that soil for growing papyrus. And papyrus was used for a variety of things like fishing nets and boxes and clothing and rope and so on. But its most important use was for paper. The papyrus paper was in use for a long, long time. And because of the economic features of this river, again, most of the people lived near it. And in my Encyclopedia Britannica, the 1962 edition, at that time, they said 95% of Egypt's population lived near the Nile, real close to the Nile. There are canals that have been built that take the water in irrigation canals to farther out areas to make those arable and allow crops to be grown there. The Nile supports not just agriculture, but fishing. Fishing is a huge industry. You know, in the 1960s, there was a big dam, a controversial dam that was built called the Aswan Dam. It's a big hydroelectric project, and they dammed up the river. And if you look at your map there, you can see where Aswan is. It's down in the south, or should I say up in the south, according to their geography. And it has caused a lot of problems for Egypt. But the people that did it, the leaders, didn't care. They wanted that electricity. And electricity that comes from hydroelectric source is one of the least expensive, at least in terms of producing electricity. It's not in what it does or what it can do to the actual food source from this one. What happened is the silt that used to overflow the river started getting blocked by the dam, and it built up behind the dam. So it's not getting to the areas where they were fertile in the past. So the routine annual flooding doesn't happen anymore. And these floods were necessary for several reasons. One, it flushed the clean and it cleaned the water from human and agricultural debris. The water is now becoming more polluted, and it's a real concern. The delta is becoming less fertile. When this happens, the fishing goes down, fishing industry, and the food industry goes down. So they're buying more food abroad. Actually, they're buying a lot from Israel. Israel developed the Jezreel Valley in the late 1800s, and it is now the breadbasket of the Middle East and beyond. The problem here, though, in our text says it's going to dry up. And you can see it starting to do that with this dam. The text says, and the river shall be wasted and dried up. That's going to ruin the Egyptians' trade and navigation, but primarily the economic support of the country, because that Nile produces a lot of agriculture and fishing. As I said, the overflowing of that river really produced some fertile areas that our text says it's going to be dried up. It is not going to continue to do this. It's going to be caused by some great drought or the practices of the leaders. And God is in control of this, and he's saying it's going to happen. The economic benefits that this river has are going to be greatly diminished. And it's going down ever since that Aswan Dam has been built. And again, it was really controversial. A lot of people didn't want it, but the leaders could care less. The leaders could care less. The text says, the reeds and the flags shall wither away. And it's talking about the crops on the banks and right into the near part of the river. They're going to dry up and wither away. The flags and the reeds are basically just reeds with little teeny flowers on them. That's what it's referring to. Egyptian industry is going to be completely broken. And this is how God does things. He corrects sin by bringing conditions that human beings can't correct. He changes things that are far bigger than we are, and he makes things in such a way happen that causes us to either realize our behavior or perish because of it. So let's look at the next several verses here, 7 through 10. The meadows by the Nile, by the brink of the Nile, And all the sown fields of the Nile shall become dry, be driven away, and be no more. And the fishers shall lament. And all they that cast angle into the Nile shall mourn, and they that spread nets upon the water shall languish. Moreover, they that work in combed flax, and they that weave white cloth shall be confounded. And the pillars of Egypt shall be broken in pieces. All they that work for hire shall be grieved in soul. Now this just continues to talk about the destruction of the economy because of the conditions of the Nile. The meadows are those on the banks and where the canals were feeding to provide arable land. And the way the Hebrew is just describing this, it's going to happen. When it does, it's going to be sudden. So it's like this Aswan Dam, for example, has been building up the silt, and the river has not been outpouring the silt, and the delta has been shrinking. But when the drying happens, it's going to be in stages, and it's going to happen relatively quickly. First, the Nile, then the canals, then the grass, and finally the meadows. And the drought is going to come over the entire land of Egypt, and it's going to just destroy the economic sustenance. If you destroy the economy of a country, you've ruined the country, because people can't work, they can't earn a living, they can therefore now get food. It is terrible to destroy the economy of a country. You can see our economy right now in the United States of America is better than it has been for many, many years. The unemployment rate is lower than it ever has been in my lifetime. And it's been said that if you're not working today, it's because you don't want to. There's plenty of jobs out there, and there's thousands of them that are going unfilled because there's more jobs than there are people to fill them. That produces a society that is wealthy and relatively happy. Relatively happy. The fishing industry in the Nile is also going to suffer. And the text cites two levels of fishing. The anglers, which are the fishers, they're not going to be able to get any fish. And the netters, which are the commercial fishermen, they're not going to be able to get enough catch to stay in business. Egypt has been and is and has an important industry in fishing. When the Nile fills with water, it's also said to be filled with these small fish, and I don't know what they're called, but Herodotus refers to them in his history. And what an economic benefit it was, because people could go fishing and get food, and the commercial fishermen were pulling in a lot of these. But here's Isaiah saying, they shall mourn. So not only is God going to take away the agriculture, he's going to take away the fishing industry as well. And individual fishermen are not going to be able to pull any fish out for their families. And the commercial fishermen are not going to be able to pull large amounts of fish out through their nets for trade and putting into the stores. It's sad to see this happening, but the reason that it happens is because of the leaders who have led the people against Israel for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years. This rich river, sooner or later, as the text says, is going to be dry, and it's going to be just a haunting death for everybody that depends on that river. And again, back in 1962, the Encyclopedia Britannica said 95% of the people live near the Nile in Egypt. That's really something to pay attention to. And the text moves on to talk about another industry, a third industry, as he said, however, they that work in fine flax. And he's talking about fine linen, cloth, yarn, and even back in biblical times, such as 1 Kings 10 and Ezekiel 27, there were references to the prowess of the Egyptians because of the flax that was growing on the banks and in the delta. And they would make cloth to sell. And God's saying, I'm going to take this away from you too. In other words, he's saying, I'm taking away your economic sustenance because of the way you have treated Israel. They even made fishing nets from this stuff. The weavers shall be confounded. That's because, one, they're not going to be able to make anything, and two, they're not going to have anything to sell because the river's dried up. The text moves on to say, and they shall be broken for the purpose thereof. In other words, they're going to be real disappointed because they're just not going to have anything to make or sell. So God's destroying agriculture, he's destroying the fishing industry, and he's destroying the fabric industry. He's going to take this away. And then we're looking at princes that he designates here. And he's referring, the pieces, the princes are the next one. He's referring to the economic foundation in these verses of their economy that he's ripping apart. He's taking it away from them. Now the text moves on here, and I've combined a little bit of the King James here, not in the text, but in what I'm going to say, because some of you have different translations and there's different words. The text moves on in verse 11 and 12, and it says, the princes of Zoan are utterly foolish. The counsel of the wisest counselor of Pharaoh has become brutish. How say ye unto Pharaoh, I am the son of the wise, the son of ancient kings. Where then are the wise men? And let them tell thee now, and let them know what Jehovah of hosts hath purposed concerning Egypt. Now he's starting to say the reasons for him doing all this. Now it was earlier said in chapter 18 and earlier in this chapter, but he's getting very, very exact. As he's saying, I'm doing this because of the decisions of your leaders. He's actually saying that they would be unable to devise any means to keep these calamities from happening because God's going to bring them. Again, God brings calamities on people, countries, that are of such a magnitude that only he can control, and you can't control them because he wants to make a correction. Don't ever think that things just sort of happen. God controls everything. And he's going to cause national misery because of these leaders. And they were paying attention to unwise counselors. You know, one of the most difficult tasks for anybody that's a leader is to have counselors that are wise, truthful, and aren't currying favor, that'll give them what they need to hear as opposed to what they want to hear. Now, he uses the term here, Zoan. Zoan was an area, and what's still sort of listed there in the north. It was a city in Lower Egypt called the Tans of the Greeks. And we see it in Numbers 13:22. It's mentioned by Moses, and it's right near the mouth of the Nile. The ruins still exist, and I put a picture in your notes to show what's left of it. And there's a number of blocks of granite, and there's 7 obelisks of granite. There's a statue to one of their gods, Isis. It was the capital of a dynasty called the Tannitic Kings. This was the place, the exact place, where Moses dealt with Pharaoh and brought the plagues leading up to the Exodus. Psalm 78:12 says, "Marvelous things did he in the sight of their fathers in the land of Egypt, in the field of Zoan." So God first mentions the leaders in Zoan, and he's causing them, through their counselors, to get bad information, because he wants this to happen. And then he says they're fools, because they're unable to prepare for these impending calamities. They listen to these foolish counselors. They had the ability. God probably brought these counselors to them with these lies, and they were currying favor. They weren't telling them the truth. They were flattering the king. Now, how often does that happen? Flattery gets you really nowhere with the actual execution of the responsibilities they have in government or even in industry or wherever. It causes ruin rather than the welfare of the kingdom. Now the text says the wise counselor of Pharaoh. Pharaoh, as we know, was a common name, the same as Caesar or king. And that name was used in Egypt up until the last one who had that name was Farouk. Farouk was Pharaoh from 36 to 52, called himself a Pharaoh and a king. After him, Nasser and Sadat, those guys all went to war with Israel. They all did on multiple occasions. And we're going to look at that in our next session to see how they wreck the economy. So here's God saying, it's your leaders that are wrecking the economy, and they got bad counselors that they're listening to. And he says to the advisors, why do you flatter? Now let them see what it is that they're doing. Why remind him of his ancestry? They're telling him how great he is, that he comes from a long line of pharaohs, and he's important. And they're inflating him with this idea of his own wisdom. They're pumping him up. It's a common practice in the political arena to flatter, to curry favor, to build people up, to try and get yourself another position of some sort that you desire. And the kings that allow this to happen usually lead their country into ruin. And that's what God is saying here. I'm leading you into this because of the way you treated Israel. And he says to them, where are they? Where are the good counselors? Where are those that know what they should be doing? The sense is that there's this time and there's distress that's coming on Egypt, and they refuse to acknowledge it. And he's saying, where are the correct counselors? And he's making an implied reference going back to Joseph, where Joseph knew through dreams that Pharaoh had that there was a 7-year famine coming. And Joseph provided the proper counsel to sustain Egypt through that 7 years of famine. And they did more than survive. They thrived when the rest of the Mideast and Africa were starving. And he's saying here, let them just announce this economic distress that's coming on the nation and take the proper measures. But they won't do it. So God lets them, and he pushes them into doing what they're doing. So it does cause economic distress and a ruin. If they would do this, then the kingdom would not be ruined. But because they have done these things, and again, primarily because of the violation of the Abrahamic covenant where they have said, I'm going to curse Israel. Now the text finishes up here in verses 13 to 15, where he affirms this again. The princes of Zoan are become fools. The princes of Memphis, now some of your Bibles may say Nosh instead of Memphis, because they're synonymous terms, are deceived. They have caused Egypt to go astray, that are the cornerstone of her tribes. Jehovah hath mingled a spirit of perverseness in the midst of her. And they have caused Egypt to go astray, and their work thereof as a drunken man staggereth in his vomit. Neither shall there be for Egypt any work which head or tail or palm branch or rush may do. Was he saying that the answer that the wise men should be having are nowhere to be found, because God has caused them to become foolish because of their attitude. And Isaiah begins again with this verb, are become fools. They become fools, and then it's clear to God they're not going to turn from that, so he causes them to stay in that state, to cause ruin, which is his judgment. And they're not going to be any help. The counselors, the princes, all the leaders, they're not going to be any help in this time of distress. The princes of Noth also have been deceived. And again, Noth, in some of your versions there, is the word for Memphis. Just like the serpent beguiled Eve, so the princes of Noth, or Memphis, profess to be wise. They've become fools. They were never really wise in the first place, but they thought they were. They were easily deceived. Now he mentions this Noth, or he mentions, let's look at Memphis. And on the map you can see that they are in opposite ends of the Nile. Memphis is in the south, which is Upper Egypt, and the other is in the north, Zoan. So he's covering the whole country here. That's how he's decided, stating this. And basically what he's saying is this confusion that he's going to put onto these leaders and these counselors is going to be over the whole country. It's not going to be isolated. It's the whole thing, the whole Nile. And the consequences are that these people lead Israel astray. They started to lead Israel astray, and he's going to continue to cause them to do that. And these people have the societal position of, and the reference is here to be the cornerstone of the tribes. In other words, they're the foundation, the pillars of Egyptian society, the government, the wealthy people, the business leaders. These are the top people, the opinion makers, the influencers. God gives them this spirit of perverseness, causing them to act in a manner which he describes as consistent with a drunken man who's vomiting. In other words, he's got no control over his own actions. It's gone. The Apostle Paul tells us in the book of Ephesians not to be drunk or not to be controlled by drink. Let your control be by this Holy Spirit. Well, drinking too much controls you. It takes away your own control. And that's what he's showing here. And that's what these leaders are doing. They have turned away from Israel. They have persecuted Israel. They continue to persecute Israel. So God gives them this spirit of perverseness where they can't control themselves anymore. They have to do this persecution, if you will, of Israel. And God judges them for it. And then he goes on to say, neither shall there be any work. In other words, that no man, because everybody, I like the old King James discomfited term, they're so harmed by this that no man, a prince, a politician, a religious leader, anybody are going to be able to give any advice or anything that's going to be worthwhile to pull them away from this calamity. Because God has decided so it will be. And he follows up with those affected as the head and the tail. High, low, doesn't matter for the people working in the fields, doesn't matter if you're a government official or a leader of some industry. Everybody's going to be affected by this, from the highest rank to the lowest rank. All the politicians, all the leaders in various categories, everywhere in the country. All the elite, if you will, that were cited earlier in fishing, in agriculture, in textile, all their industries, when that Nile dries up, and it will dry up because God has said it's going to dry up. And you know I've said this a lot, that the Hebrew language in the biblical Hebrew, only has two tenses, completed and incompleted. This prophecy is given in the completed tense. So what God says will happen in time and space in his mind's already happened. It's done. It can't be changed. It cannot be changed. And when we look at this verse here, this last one, it just basically sums up all of the calamities that are coming on Egypt for the way that they have treated Israel. And it will happen. This river will dry up. It will stop producing. And that Aswan Dam is one of the early signs that God is starting to do this. Let us pray.